stay here. I'm going to try and secure a safe path through these canyons.
Let me know if you can reach that massive obelisk we saw. I've never seen anything like it.
August also seems drawn to it. I'm sensing great agitation. August wants to follow you.
Hold August until I'm through, Pia. It's not safe. It looks like we weren't the first humans here. I'm seeing a number of dead bodies.
The same people whose vehicles we saw? Out in the sand?
Possibly. I'm guessing this party was sent out by Monroy, from that fort. Doesn't look like these guys had much more luck.
Any more clues to who they were, what they were doing here, would be quite fascinating. Keep your eyes open.
Zahidi, I found some writing. Seems to be anthropological notes from a Dr. Indira Ocasio.
A scientist among Monroy's people? What did she find?
She was documenting what happened from the day they met the natives. Pax, they called them. Description matches August. She says they were welcomed with open arms.
Pack. Yes, that would certainly fit August. Incredible.
I found some pages written by Monroy, these people's leader. He led the raiding party into this canyon, believing it was the Pharaoh's base, that he could root them out.
Maybe they were trying to help August's people.
Tiago, does August know anything about this Monroy?
I've tried asking, but August won't speak about this place to me.
Path to the obelisk is clear.
August and I are just right behind you, Outrider.
Shouldn't you be waiting in the camp for my signal?
Sorry, August slipped out. I couldn't,
You all have to see this.
August. What happened here?
Incoming! Get out of there! Now!
Shit. Hide! In there! Go!
giant cockroaches! I'm right here! Just help me! Grab the gun! August! Please! Where are you going?
Take cover, quick!
No! It's me, Tiago! You know me! Please, August! I'm your friend! It's August! August. August.
What the hell happened to August?
August's people weren't wiped out by savages.
They became savages.
Why would they do that?
Outrider, we're burying August's body. Do you want to join us?
I'm not there yet. I'm gonna stay a bit longer. Take another look through the camp's remains. Found something you should know about. More of Monroy's writing. Seems he discovered the same thing we did. About the Pax transforming.
Does he say why? Why they would do that to themselves?
No. Another keystone?
Whenever you're ready to head out, we'll be waiting for you at camp.
We're so close. The signal's coming from just beyond this ridge.
Stay on the lookout. You see any movement, run.
Sit tight, people. I'm gonna clear the way. It's time for some answers. What do we have here? Zahedi, I found some more writing from Monroy's people. I think we must be approaching their colony. It seems Monroy didn't believe the Pax were so peaceful. When their tech started getting fried, he suspected the Pax were trying to sabotage him. Then, just as a storm was brewing up, they caught the Pax doing one of their obelisk rituals.
Did Monroy think the Pax were causing the storm?
I, thought the same thing when I first saw August in those ruins in the forest.
Monroy ordered his soldiers to stop them. It was on that day that got me.
Please, collect all the writing you can find. Perhaps we can learn their story.
After the first big storms burned out most of their tech, sounds like Monroy got furious. He demanded explanations from the Pax and access to their powers. but they didn't understand. They offered everything they could. They led Monroy through the jungle to their sacred city.
Probably this city. The place we've discovered.
Pax took him to the Grand Temple, tried to show him how they communed with the anomaly. But Monroy thought it was a ploy to assassinate him. He ordered the executions of the Pax leaders and locked down the temple. They're countless cages. They're filled with skeletons. They look like Pax. After they'd executed the Pax leaders, Monroy's people started moving into the city. This was their colony. They took over the homes of the Pax, forcing them to work for them, to serve them.
In other words, they made them slaves. They believed the loss of their machinery was the Pax's fault.
Doesn't matter what they believed. There's no excuse for enslaving another race.
There's gotta be hundreds of dead Pax here, executed, piled up. This whole city is a mass grave.
Monroy's people, they did this.
I think it's getting real clear who the Pax is scared of, who they changed themselves into pharaohs to protect themselves from.
Seems like they got hit by the worst storm yet. Hundreds died, humans and Pax. Some of the obelisks were damaged too, so whatever the Pax once were doing to control the storms, they couldn't do it anymore. He feared an uprising, losing control as Pax started to abandon the city. Nikolai Galyatkin, Monroy made him general and put him in charge of weapons production.
No doubt the same weapons the pharaohs used against them later.
This place, it was a slave market. Monroy. This palace covered with flag was always gotta be his face. He named himself a tyrant. Courtyard's clear. Monroy was sending out raids to hunt down the fleeing packs. And that's when the uprising he'd predicted finally found him. But it wasn't the packs. At least, not as he expected.
The Ferals. He never saw them coming.
But Monroy didn't retreat. That asshole dug in out there, in the desert, and tried to track them down where they were coming from. That's when he found the canyon and the Great Omnibus. He finally understood there who the Ferals were. But that's when he got word that the city was under attack.
And so it was. The beginning of the end.
I made it to the top. Palace is clear.
What do you see?
You better come up here and see for yourself.
This Monroy was a madman. Hey, there's a ship!
Is that the Caravel?
That's not possible. The Caravel never left Earth. Its engines exploded. Tens of thousands died.
Then what the hell are we looking at?
The source of the fucking signal. Monroy's signal. There's no place beyond the storm. It's coming from in there, protected from the anomaly, just like the uplink in your goddamn briefcase.
I don't fucking understand.
Neither do I. It doesn't make any sense. Everyone saw the Caravel explode during its construction. Even if the people left on Earth were able to rebuild the ship, they left after us. We were the first. Nevertheless, what's certain is that Monroy enslaved August's people. He butchered them, and they turned. They mutated into savages willingly, so they could fight back.
I'm done with all this. Whatever's waiting for you on that ship, I want no part of it.
Tiago, you can't leave us now.
I thought you weren't a deserter.
What they did to August's people. What our people did to August, don't you see? Thank you for letting me walk a ways with you.
We're going to finish this. We're finding a way into the Caravel.
This is it now. That ship, the signal, the garden. I'm ready to of all this. We'll leave on your word.
There has to be a way inside the ship. I'll radio when I've secured a path.
There's no place beyond the anomaly. Why are we still heading to this stupid ship?
If the signal is shielded from the anomaly inside, it means we can use the uplink in there to contact the Flores. All the supplies, the resources, the tech. We're gonna bring them down today.
Not done going through hell yet. When the pack started to flee the city, Monroy rounded up every last one of them that stayed behind, that were loyal and trusting, and threw them into these labor camps.
But I know of the packs, they could not have survived long in there.
It was all Monroy. When he understood the packs were turning into ferals, he sent out an order to murder them all before they could transform. All but enough. Monroy returned to the city to find it under siege. They battled for days, a complete bloodbath. And then, another storm hit. Monroy's people were decimated. That's when they spotted the Flores in orbit and called for help.
They started broadcasting the signal.
Help never came. And Monroy ordered a retreat to the ship and locked it down. All this time, all we've been through. The battlefields, the jungles, the alien ruins, the desert. All we've lost. I can't believe we're finally here. The goddamn signal I heard the day we landed, and still... none of it makes any sense.
Oh, I think I'm starting to put it all together. The way the packs controlled the anomaly with their obelisks, they are what kept the planet's energy in check. They were the balance. But when Monroy stopped the packs from using the obelisks out of pure fear of what he couldn't understand, the anomaly spread like wildfire across the planet. The storms surging out of control, mutating everything.
All this time thinking we were gonna reach a place beyond the anomaly. Hoping to find the place it all started. Where Monroy started it.
hordes. Thousands climbing over each other, trying to reach the Flores as it launched.
They're the ones who got left behind. And half of them probably slaughtered the rest for a last seat on the Caravel. Tanner and Yakum, we all should have been down there with the rest. Hopeless, drowning in chaos. Nothing but dictators and madmen set loose.
If the Caravel's engine hadn't exploded and killed most of the Outriders.
We would have been the ones left on Earth. 2 more soldiers in Monroy's damn army. Fighting for any way off the Earth. Coming here to slaughter the Pax. And screwing up the whole damn planet. Before you all ever set foot on it. I'm inside the ship. It's still operational. Whatever's playing the signal, it's in here.
The end of the road, one way or another.
Mayday! Mayday! Hillingdon! You must! 37.5673 degrees north. 22.80116 degrees east. Mayday!
Listen.
Mayday! Hillingdon!
Signal. We're here.
37.5673 degrees north. 22.80116 degrees east. Mayday! Mayday! Hillingdon! You must!
It works.
37.5673 degrees north.
Oh God, it works.
22.80116
Someone hit the lights.
east. Mayday! Mayday!
Look. It's exactly as I saw it. As we saw it.
China, that's not real. That's this planet, all right, but it's long gone.
No. No, it's... Get the fuck off! It's...
Go away. I'm in no mood for this today.
You okay?
You're here. I had imagined this so many times. Never you.
Who are you?
Who am I?
Monroy?
But how? How did this ship get here before us?
How do you think? You people left us to die as the Earth crumbled. But I don't die so easy, do I? No, we built a new engine. An engine that shamed all others before it. So while you were still crawling through deep space, we were already here. Oh, you should have seen it. Their primitive civilization, the natives, they treated us like gods.
Yeah. I've seen what you did to the natives.
Oh, I see now. This isn't a rescue. Why didn't you come when we sent out the distress call? Huh? It's 30 years since the Flores arrived in our skies. 30 years surviving in this hell.
This hell was because of you. My entire life trapped in that valley, slaughtering each other for nothing. You robbed our people of hope before we even got here.
Don't flatter yourselves. You were as capable of every wickedness. The Pax weren't as docile as they looked. They had powers. So much power. Things I had to understand.
So you just rounded them up? You tortured them, you son of a bitch.
Are you really so naive? How long before those creatures tired of us? Before they turned against us? They would have had us on our bloody knees. All that I wanted was their powers. For us. For all of us. So that we could survive, so we could be strong. Don't you see? We lost the Earth because we were meant for something more. but for the grace of I go you, my child. Do you think that you would be standing there with the powers of a god if it hadn't been for me? All that I've done for humanity. I saved us.
You cursed us.
But I won.
It's done. Fuck him.
No more wasting time. I have to tap the uplink into the Caravel's power so we can reach the Flores before we...
Shit. We found this. We gotta go.
No, leave me. I have to do this.
Do what you gotta do, Doc. That door won't hold long.
Outrider, if that beast cracks this ship's hull, we lose electronics, we lose the pods, we lose everything.
I'll take care of it. You just get those pods down. You have to fear is me. to me!
Still transmitting the launch code. Hold on.
Hurry it up! Zahedi? What's happening in there?
It's working! I've contacted the Flores. Transmitting the first launch codes. Now!
God damn it, Doc! We can't hold them!
Place is gonna blow!
Almost there. Almost there!
Zahedi, get out of there! We have to leave!
I can't! I have to transmit the codes!
My God! Get me my gun! Get out of there, Zahedi! You'll be shot!
The pods are more important than me!
Tiago!
Get in! I'm not losing any more friends.
Oh, shit. I guess it's over.
The signal, the uplink, it was all for nothing.
Wait, guys, look. Over there.
The pods? It worked?
You did it.
My God. I guess some of the commands went through after all.
Well, like I always say, it ain't over till it's over. What the hell? Monroy's people?
No, I don't think so.
Who are you?
We're from the war zone. Are you the Outriders?
We heard tales about an altered.
Outriders. Opening the frontier. Finding a cure in the forest. We've been following your trail since the war zone.
So, what now? We keep moving. Buds! They did it.